Giants on the beat.
What's good, everyone? So we're not with another video for the channel. Welcome back to DMV Sports Zone, and sorry for being out on the fantasy preview video, but I'm back now with none other than the weekly game previews for the Washington football team. And as always, these previews, at least I try to be very objective with these previews and give you guys everything you need in short order before the upcoming matchup. So without further ado, let's get started. So with this week's matchup, Washington will be playing against the New York Giants. And as I start every single week off with in these videos, I'll start off with the injury report news. So for Washington, another positive is that the injury reports just keep on getting shorter, which is always good to hear at this point in the season, right? Usually the last couple of years it's gotten longer, but it's gotten shorter. Some negatives though with the injury report news is that a lot of players still did not practice on Wednesday. Joshua Garnett, the backup guard for Washington, did not practice, and it was due to an illness, but the illness was not COVID related, so that's always good news. Greg Stroman, a very good up-and-coming cornerback for this team, was also out on Wednesday with a foot injury. The starting center for Washington and Chase Roulier was out with a knee injury, which is major news. The offensive line is already very bad. It's one of the worst in the league, but you don't have your guy, one of your stout offensive linemen, come Sunday. It's going to be very bad news for that stout Giants defensive front. So that's just a little there. Dwayne Haskins also did not practice on Wednesday, and I know there's a lot of speculation around about him possibly being traded before the trade deadline, and that's news that we'll get to as we get closer to the deadline. But he did miss practice today with a severe stomach illness, the same illness that he was suffering on Sunday. He was actually told to go home today during practice. So yeah, hopefully he recovers. And right now he's our third string quarterback. Crazy, right? He was our starter for what, 4 weeks, and yeah, just things didn't go his way, but it is what it is. And I expect him to be back Sunday as that third string quarterback, if he's even active, because he possibly could be inactive as well. And then in terms of who was limited in practice on Wednesday, only Antonio Gibson was, but that's a big issue because Antonio Gibson is the starting running back for the Washington football team, and he's a very good young up-and-coming back at that. And he missed practice with a toe injury, which is new. A lot of people don't think it was suffered during the game on Sunday, but hopefully he recovers, and we'll know more as we know every week towards the end of the week, and we'll know more specifically by Friday in terms of his availability on Sunday. I do still expect him to go, but we shall see come later in the week. And then Kyle Allen, who Coach Rivera said would be the starter if everything was okay this week, everything went well, was a full go in practice on Wednesday after suffering a left shoulder injury against the Rams last Sunday. So I'll mention towards the end of the video how specifically I feel about him, but that's good for your team, right? If you get your guy and Kyle Allen to be ready by Sunday, and I think from all signs he will be okay come Sunday. And then with the Giants, the advantage there is that they're going to this matchup much healthier than Washington. There were a couple players who were limited in practice on Wednesday, and Kyler Fackrell, the linebacker, with an ankle injury. Dexter Lawrence, a stud defensive tackle, was limited with a knee injury. Darius Slayton, a very good wide receiver, second-year wide receiver, much like Terry McLaurin, who was limited with a foot injury. And then Jabril Peppers, one of their starting defensive backs, was limited with an ankle injury. But everybody else was full go this Wednesday, and I think a lot of those players that I mentioned will be available come Sunday. So again, the Giants are definitely at an advantage there in terms of their health at this point in the season. And then some logistics about the game as we get to every single video. The game will be shown on Fox at the nice traditional time of 1 p.m. Eastern time. The game will be played at MetLife Stadium up in New Jersey this week, where Washington has, as I know a lot of Washington football fans know this by now, has notoriously struggled in the past. So might be another tough game for Washington, although there won't be any fans, I believe, so there won't be that true home field advantage come Sunday. The odds makers right now actually have New York, the 0-5 team, as a 3-point favorite coming to this matchup, which is interesting to say the least, but sort of makes sense because Washington's in quarterback limbo right now. Washington doesn't really have a quarterback situation that is settled right now, while the Giants do, and that's always a plus in the NFL, right? Because the quarterback is the most important position, and Washington's defense has just not been stepping up the last couple weeks. It hasn't been living up to its potential. So, I mean, I kind of understand why the Giants are a 3-point favorite, but at the same time, they're both pretty bad teams. So And then with the mini Week 5 recap for both teams as part of the Last We Saw Them segment. For Washington, first and foremost, team is coming off an incredibly embarrassing loss once again against the Rams, 30-10 on Sunday. As I mentioned in the recap video, which you guys can see, it was a sloppy game by Washington all around, and not just because of the terrible weather, which was terrible. There were downpours, and it was just very sloppy game in terms of the weather. But Washington offense mustered just 150 total offensive yards on Sunday. 150 total offensive yards. Not passing yards, not rushing yards, total. Neither one of Washington's quarterbacks who started went over 100 yards, although, to be fair, if Kyle Allen did stay in the game, he was on that track to have a pretty decent game overall. So there's that for you. The only two offensive weapons Washington has, and stud rookie Antonio Gibson at the running back position and Terry McLaurin at the wide receiver position, were just absolutely neutralized by that Rams defense last week. And it also helps for the Rams defensive line to pretty much just put pressure on the Washington offensive line nonstop and sort of not allow the quarterback to have any time to throw the ball, and that pretty much happened all game last week. Washington's defense was nowhere to be found for the entire first half, especially, and even while slowing the Rams offense down towards the end of the game, which, you know, the weather sort of factored into that a lot. But even while doing that, it just wasn't the type of unit that we expected to see coming into the season, with Jack Del Rio being the defensive coordinator and Ron Rivera being the new head coach. So it was just not a great showing all around. There was a great pick by Kendall Fuller, who's had 3 picks in a game and a half up until that point, and now 2 games. But outside of Kendall Fuller, the whole defense was just not good. So many miscues. Once again, Landon Collins, Mr. $14 million a year safety, just not worth the money. He just was not good. He hasn't been good in coverage. Usually good as a linebacker, but if you pay a guy $14 million to be a safety, I mean, you sort of expect more out of him, right? The defense also couldn't really contain tight ends, as is the norm, as has been the norm for the last couple of years. And Gerald Everett did have a pretty good game. I believe he had 4 catches for 90 yards, so had a pretty good game, especially for a tight end. The one positive though out of the game was that Alex Smith finally completed his recovery, his full recovery from an injury he sustained nearly 2 years ago. And we all know the story. We all watched the Project 11 documentary and saw the intense recovery that he's been going through almost the last 2 years. And he had several infections as well, almost lost his leg, almost lost his life. So that was just a great thing to see on Sunday, you know, outside of the terrible loss that was Sunday. Just great to see Alex Smith back, and yeah, he should be up for, if not the leading contender for comeback player of the year, seriously. So now with week 6 in the horizon, Washington is again likely to go with Kyle Allen for the start, if all things go, and I think he should be healthy up until that point, which sort of makes sense because I believe he is the best quarterback on this roster. It's sort of by default because Dwayne Haskins is not it, and at least at this point, we'll see down the road. We'll see if he doesn't get traded. And then Alex Smith, you know, he did get some playing time on Sunday, but we got to be honest, guys, he just wasn't it. It's hard to be good with a terrible offensive line, but Alex Smith also wasn't making great throws, just making checkdowns, which we usually see out of him, which I talked about in the offseason. But yeah, Allen's sort of the best by default, so we shall see what we have out of him in his second start of the season. And the rival Giants, meanwhile, are coming off a tough, close loss to the Cowboys, 37-34. For the most part, New York did keep Dak Prescott contained before he went down for the season with a significant ankle injury. And rivalries aside, I know we didn't mention this on the channel after the Washington loss last week, but prayers up to Dak Prescott. He seems like a good guy all around. We all know what he's been through in the offseason and stuff, so prayers to him and prayers that he sustains a full recovery and is back in no time. But again, rivalries aside, because we all hate the Cowboys, but this is more than just football, right? The Giants defense just couldn't stop Ezekiel Elliott on the ground, which may bode well though for Antonio Gibson this week. And they also couldn't really contain the Cowboys receivers outside of Amari Cooper, who I'll mention a little bit later, but James Bradbury did a very fine job containing. CeeDee Lamb led the Cowboys last week with 8 catches for 124 yards, which should bode well for Terry McLaurin this week. At the same time, if he gets a lot of coverage from Bradbury, we'll see, right? We'll see. Meanwhile, the Giants didn't really produce much through the air, although Darius Slayton managed to have a huge game last week. I believe it was like 124 yards on 8 catches, something like that, which is very, very good, especially out of a second-year receiver. And the Giants' running game wasn't terrible last week, but wasn't great either. They had Devontae Freeman, who they picked up after Saquon Barkley, unfortunately for them and for football in general, suffered a torn ACL a couple weeks back, and they picked Devontae Freeman up after being a free agent for a while, actually. They're being released by the Atlanta Falcons. So he put up 60 yards and a rushing touchdown. Again, not spectacular numbers, was okay for the game, but yeah, it is what it is for that Giants rushing game at this point without Saquon. So it'll be interesting to see if the Giants can step it up this week and if the defense could have a solid outing against a terrible, terrible Washington offense as it stands right now. And then some key positional battles. The first battle that I want to get into this week, and it feels like every single week I talk about the Washington defensive line, but let's talk about them again, right? Washington's defensive line versus New York's offensive line. Washington, even though admittedly they didn't have a great game last week, I don't even know if they put up a sack or two or any, I really don't know. But at the same time, they do field one of the most talented defensive lines still, and they did get Chase Young, the stud rookie defensive end out of Ohio State, back last week after missing a game with a groin injury. So they're very talented, and they could, in a snap, put up 3-4 sacks. I really believe that, and they did that just a couple weeks back. You don't have to go too far back to really see that. And Giants' offensive line, meanwhile, much like Washington's, is one of the worst in the league, and I believe it's even ranked last by Football Outsiders as of this point in the season. So definitely capable of being beaten up on, and that Washington defensive line should get a couple sacks against that Giants offensive line if they actually live up to the potential that they showed, in the first 2 weeks of the season. But the matchup does look like a mismatch on paper in favor of Washington, but Washington's defensive line does need to bounce back from last week's down performance and really perform once again to their talent, to their potential. And then with the second matchup, we got the New York wide receivers versus Washington cornerbacks. The Giants, while not having as great of a wide receiving group as the Rams, right, with Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, so on and so forth, they have a pretty solid group in veteran Golden Tate, who's been around and done a lot of good things in this league, and rising star wide receiver Darius Slayton, who I mentioned earlier, who much like Terry was a pick in the 2019 draft, but wasn't even a third-round pick, was actually a fifth-round pick. So it's crazy to see this sort of production out of a fifth-round receiver, but he's been balling, and he had an awesome game last week, as I mentioned earlier. So Washington definitely needs to keep an eye out for Darius Slayton during the course of the game. Washington cornerback group, though, is arguably, if you look at statistics, top 10 in the league, like legit. They're led by Kendall Fuller. They also have solid guys like Fabian Moreau, Jimmy Moreland, Ronald Darby, and even Cameron Curl in the nickel. They've all stepped up tremendously this season and definitely given that defensive back group as a whole the boost that they need, the boost that we haven't seen the last couple of years outside of the Alex Smith year. But yeah, it's a solid group. It's a very solid group. I'm not talking about the safeties, right? The safeties are trash. But the cornerbacks themselves, who are going to be facing the wide receivers, are a solid group. So should be a fun matchup to watch on Sunday, much like the other two matchups. And then the last matchup that I'll discuss is Washington wide receiver Terry McLaurin versus Giants cornerback James Bradberry. And this is probably going to be the best matchup on Sunday, much like the Terry-Jalen Ramsey matchup last week, as you got a solid cornerback in James Bradberry, who is a big signing in the offseason for the Giants, who will be facing a stud wide receiver in this league and Terry McLaurin for Washington. And I said last week that if Jalen Ramsey could slow Terry McLaurin down and get him a max of 75 yards, and the Rams had a very good chance of winning the game. And would you look at that? Terry had 30 yards receiving, and he definitely won the game last week. We all saw that. And I'll pretty much say the same this week, right? James Bradberry locked down Amari Cooper last week. I believe it was like 2 catches for 23 yards for Cooper, which is insane, right? Because it is Amari Cooper, and I know he has had bad games in the past, but at the same time, James Bradberry did lock him down very much throughout the course of the game. So if Terry somehow rebounds this week, then I think Washington has a very good chance of winning the game, and there is a very good chance of that happening. But at the same time, if Bradberry locks down another receiver, Terry McLaurin, Washington's in for another long game. So we shall see come Sunday. And then last but not least, my predictions and final thoughts. Ultimately, I believe Washington's defensive line will actually step it up this week, and we'll actually have about 2 to 3 sacks, if not more, this week against the Giants offensive line. I think Darius Slayton will have a solid game this week as well if he plays. But the Giants receiving group as a whole will be slowed down by the Washington cornerbacks, much like they were actually, even though Dallas is terrible on defense, they're pretty much shut down by the cornerbacks in Dallas outside of Darius Slayton. And Washington has a solid cornerback group. So, hey man, the proof is in the pudding, right? So I think Washington's cornerbacks will have a very solid outing on Sunday. Terry McLaurin will not have a spectacular game by any means, but I still think he'll have a semi-rebound this week, especially if Kyle Allen plays, because he was getting some good looks early in the game last week when Kyle Allen was playing. But when Alex Smith entered the game, it was just absolutely zero catches, zero production out of Terry McLaurin. So Kyle Allen plays, I think Terry will have a pretty good game. Maybe not his boom games that we've seen in the past, but pretty good game. I believe the Giants defensive line will also get a couple of sacks on Washington's putrid offensive line, and I think that they'll do some work against that offensive line, especially if Chase Roullier does not suit up on Sunday, because that would be a huge loss if he doesn't. And my biggest prediction is I think Antonio Gibson has a great game this week and reaches, if not exceeds, 100 total scrimmage yards on Sunday. I think he's going to have a sizable game. I know the Giants' defensive front is very stout, so I don't think he's going to go over 100 rushing yards, but I think he'll find a way to go over 100 total yards. Maybe have 60 yards rushing, 40 yards through the air, 50 yards through the air. So I think he'll have that sort of game on Sunday. So having said all that, it should be an interesting game. I'm not saying great game. I'm saying interesting this week because remember, 1-4 team against the 0-5 team. But it will be an interesting watch on Sunday with two bad teams that are still some way, somehow actually in the thick of things in the NFC East because of how bad the division is, and Dak Prescott going down with the Cowboys and Andy Dalton sort of taking his place. The division is wide open no matter how bad you are. It's just crazy to say, but it is the truth. And ultimately, if you were to ask me before last week's Giants-Cowboys game, I would probably 70% chance said that the Giants would have won this week against Washington, but the way Daniel Jones has underperformed for several games now, a string of games now, and really underperformed last week. He had, 220 yards, was 20 for 36, something like that, and no touchdown, no picks against a terrible Dallas secondary to put up just those numbers. I mean, he's facing a much tougher secondary this week, and I actually think Washington barely squeaks out the win, 24-21 this week. And don't get me wrong, unlike a lot of people, I knew from Daniel Jones' first preseason start that he was better than Dwayne Haskins. I've been riding that train for a long time that Daniel Jones has been better than Dwayne Haskins, and I'm still on that train, even though it is sort of wish-washy now because they're both pretty bad quarterbacks. I think we found that out over the last several weeks and stuff, but I still think he's better. And at the same time, I still think that Kyle Allen could put up comparable numbers, including the touchdown interception ratio, to Daniel Jones at this point. I really believe that. And while McLaurin and Darius Slayton might cancel each other out in the game in terms of their performances and stuff, I think Antonio Gibson will be the biggest contributor to the Washington football team barely squeaking out the win this week. I really believe that. I think he just gives them a slight edge at this point. So the biggest caveat though is Kyle Allen has to stay healthy. If he doesn't, then the Giants win. I'm serious. At this point, the Giants win. But if he does, then I think Washington has a very solid chance of winning. So that's it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the DMV Sports Zone channel as we try to post fire content on here as much as possible, as well as our Instagram page, all lowercase DMV Sports Zone, and our Twitter page at DMV Sports Zone. I hope you enjoyed this one, guys. I really do. Should be an interesting game on Sunday once again, and we'll see if Washington could get its second win or if the Giants could actually get their first win of the season. But yeah, thanks again for watching, guys. Make sure to watch the last video that was uploaded on Wednesday morning by Noah, who's a frequent contributor to the channel, and he posted something about the fantasy football week 6 preview, and he's very much an expert about that because he runs a fantasy sports analytics platform. So yeah, make sure you guys look out for that. And yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Have a good one. Have a good rest of your week, and hopefully a good weekend. Peace.